Hello everyone, it's upgrade time for the DT-03 Racing Fighter. Let me explain some optional parts I used. The first option to be introduced is the Tamiya 54572 full turnbuckle set. I plan to assemble it a little differently than the manual says. I'll give you a detailed explanation later. The next option is a motor. I have a Tamiya torque-tuned motor left, so I will use that. This is Tamiya 54587 aluminum spacer set. This is a necessary part for the oil shock that will be upgraded in a moment. Lastly, there is oil shock. The reason I bought this oil shock is simply because it looks cool. But there was a bit of a problem. These oil shocks are much larger in size than typical 1/10 size oil shocks. I bought it without knowing that, but when I tried to attach it, it was too big and too long. So I am planning to use another oil shock instead of using this one. Okay, let's start. First, disassemble the chassis to replace parts. Now that the chassis has been disassembled, to some extent, let's install the motor. The gearbox was also disassembled to replace the motor. After replacing the pinion gear, attach the motor to the mount. Combines the Tamiya 54572 optional steering rod with a high torque servo saver. The length of the steering rod is 50 mm as instructed in the manual. Here's some tips I used. The front lower arm is slightly wobbly. Add a shim to improve steering accuracy. A 0.2 mm shim is sufficient. After inserting the 0.2 mm shim, continue assembling the lower arm. In the case of the rear lower arm, there is no shaking at all, so there is no need for shim work. Assemble as is. Now finally, I will install the oil shock. The oil shock I initially tried to install was too big, so I bought an oil shock that fits a 110 buggy. I plan to install 85 mm shocks on the front and 70 mm shocks on the rear. As I will explain later, I ended up changing the front to 70 mm as well. I will explain why separately. This idea came from a video posted by a YouTuber named Philip Gruner. If you watch his YouTube video, you will see that he has assembled the Racing Fighter very nicely. I recommend his YouTube channel. Here's the address. Now I'll show you how to connect the oil shock and tell you the parts you need. The front oil shock in this video is 85 mm, but I recommend 70 mm. As you can see, it's too long. The front upper arm of the hop-up option is set to 20 mm as instructed. You can change the length later, so don't worry too much. First, remove the plastic upper arm and install the ball connector nut on the 25 mm stud bolt. Insert it into the upper arm position as shown in the video, and secure it with a 3 mm lock nut. Now insert the 3mm lock nut into the 30mm stud bolt, then insert the bolt into the damper stay, as shown in the video. Insert the 3mm spacer and install the oil shock. Finally, connect the ball connector nut to the 25mm stud bolt and insert it into the front axles. Insert a 1mm spacer, connect it to the oil shock, and tighten it with a lock nut. Just connect the front upper arm and you're done. Assemble the other side the same way. As I mentioned at the beginning, the front shock is too long. I purchased and will install a new 70mm shock. No matter how you look at it, the oil shock is too long. That's sad. Now let's install the rear oil shock. As in the front, insert the 3mm lock nut into the 30mm stud bolt. Secure this to the damper stay with a hexagonal screwdriver. Now insert the 1mm spacer and then install the oil shock. After installing the oil shock, secure it with a 3mm lock nut. The assembly method is similar to the front. First, insert a 20mm screw into the gearbox part where the upper arm was removed. Insert the 3mm spacer and ball connector nut in order and tighten them. For the rear axles, insert the ball connector nut into the 25mm stud bolt and assemble the oil shock with a 2mm spacer. Finally, attach the optional upper arm and you are done. The rear oil shock was very successful. It looks much more luxurious than the typical one, and the actual shock movement is very smooth. It's almost complete, combines the gearbox and chassis. Now install ESC, receiver, etc. It looks really fantastic. However, the front oil shock is still an eyesore. I plan to replace it as soon as a new oil shock arrives soon. Finally, let's put wheels on it. DT-03 build is done. I plan to use Tamiya DT-03 700 oil. Currently, the oil in the shock is about 100. As a result, the buggy is very plump. I finally changed the front shocks as well. As I mentioned, I put Tamiya DT-03 700 oil in the 70mm oil shock. By applying the same length to the front and rear oil shocks and adjusting the front and rear spring tensions, I think a very cool DT-03 was created. Check out my shorts video for more close-up photos and details. Next time, we will complete it by attaching stickers to the pre-painted body. Okay, see you next time. Please subscribe and like.